Good afternoon, everyone. This is Libby Mucciaroni, Member Engagement and Education Manager at the Organic Trade Association. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar as the Organic Center presents the benefits of organic dairy. This webinar is presented by Dr. Jessica Shade, Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center. The Organic Center is a nonprofit research and education organization based out of Washington, D.C. They work to conduct and convene credible, evidence-based science on the environmental and health effects of organic food and farming and communicate the findings to the public. The Organic Center's work is supported by companies and individuals who desire a sustainable and secure food system that promotes the health of humans and the environment. A few things before we get started today. This webinar is not being recorded. In the next week, Organic Trade Association members will receive an email including the PDF slides. For any questions or comments that you may have during our presentation today, please do share them with us in the questions panel on the platform. Following the presentation today, we will have a Q&A session where Dr. Shade will respond to your questions as time permits. For any questions that we are unable to respond directly to today, please do expect a response from our staff via email within the next week. And finally, if you happen to be having any technical issues during today's presentation, please do notify us through the questions panel, or you can email me directly. Now, let me introduce our presenter. Dr. Jessica Shade is the Director of Science Programs at the Organic Center, where she directs projects associated with communicating and conducting research related to organic agriculture. During her tenure, Dr. Shade has collaborated on a number of diverse research programs ranging from applied solutions to on-farm challenges to methods for improving environmental impacts of agriculture. Some of her most recent collaborations include projects aimed at decreasing nitrogen pollution from agricultural sources, increasing on-farm biodiversity, and developing integrated pest management solutions for organic growers. She developed and leads the center's signature conference event, Organic Confluences, which brings together policymakers, researchers, farmers, industry members, and other nonprofits to address and overcome challenges faced by the organic sector. Dr. Shade has been honored for her environmental accomplishments by the Audubon Women in Conservation through their Women Greening Food Special Recognition, the Ecological Society of America's Student Section, and Union of Concerned Scientists through their Eco-Service Award, and is a Switzer Environmental Fellow. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. I'm pleased to now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Shade.
Thanks so much, Libby. All right, so as Libby mentioned, I'm Jessica Shade. I'm the Director of Science Programs for the Organic Center. And I'm going to be talking about a study that was just released with some pretty groundbreaking results showing that organic is a really easy way to avoid pesticides, antibiotics, and synthetic growth hormones in dairy. And that a significant proportion of conventional milk that you find in the grocery store has some pretty controversial and sometimes illegal chemical residues in it. So if you had to boil down the entire study into one piece of advice, that's what this slide is. So if everyone needs to jump off the phone after this, you can. The biggest takeaway is that if you choose organic, you can get all the nutritional benefits of milk, and milk has really important nutritional benefits. It's a great source of protein, vitamins, minerals, especially for kids, without worrying about exposure to chemical contaminants like pesticides, antibiotics, and synthetic growth hormones. So that is the punchline of this study. But getting into some of the specifics, the study was led by Dr. Jean Welch and Dr. Dana Barr at Emory University, and they actually reached out to the Organic Center because they really wanted to understand what the differences were between organic and conventional dairy. And this is one of the questions that we always get from shoppers. I mean, you're at the grocery store, you're looking at the milk shelf. Is there any difference between this organic milk and this conventional milk that are sitting right next to each other at the grocery store? And so this study set out to answer that question in a scientific way. And we gathered milk from all over the United States. And when I say we, I mean researchers. So I wasn't going out to the store. This was all academically done. And Dr. Barr developed the most sensitive and sophisticated methods that exist to date for detecting residues. And all of the samples were analyzed blind, and that means that the people in the lab doing the analyses didn't know which samples were organic and which were conventional, so that we could avoid any potential bias. And when the results came in, we had some pretty strong feelings about it. On one hand, we'd expected that the organic results would come back clean. There have been a lot of studies on organic crops showing similar things. Organic has lower levels of chemicals than conventional, so we knew we probably wouldn't see any residues in the organic milk. What we were surprised by was how common residues were in conventional milk. And I'll get into the specific results in a bit, but the differences between organic and conventional were pretty drastic. And then finally, we had some really shocking results when it came to antibiotics, because we saw that a couple of antibiotics that are banned from use in both conventional and organic dairy cattle were relatively common in conventional milk. So I'll start with antibiotics because those were the most concerning results. So first of all, why should you care about antibiotics in your food? There are two main reasons that even low levels of chronic antibiotic exposure are worrying. One is that they contribute to antibiotic-resistant microbes, and antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections are extremely dangerous and have been listed as an epidemic by the World Health Organization. Another reason that antibiotics in food could be dangerous is that allergic reactions are relatively common. So hypersensitivity is the most common side effect of antibiotics. So we want to be careful of letting these kinds of things into our food supply. So now let's dive into the actual numbers. When you take a look at this graph, these are the antibiotics that we found. So we tested a really broad array, but these are the ones that we actually found detection levels of. And their names are all at the bottom of the graph, and the percentage of samples that had detectable levels of these antibiotics is on the vertical axis. And the blue bars are for conventional milk, and the green bars are for organic milk. So you might be asking yourself right about now, what green bars? And that's the first takeaway. Organic samples had no detectable levels of any antibiotics. So that's the good news. But for conventional milk, we found that 60% of the samples had detectable levels of antibiotics. And I wanted to point out amoxicillin because while most of the conventional samples, even when we found positive residues for antibiotics, they were usually still below FDA's maximum residue limit. One of our conventional samples not only tested positive for amoxicillin, but also exceeded the legal residue limit. Also, 37% of conventional samples showed residue levels of an antibiotic called sulfamethoxine, and 26% of conventional samples showed residue levels of sulfathiazole, both of which are completely banned for use in lactating cows. So that's for both conventional and organic. So any detectable residues are illegal. And that's a pretty high number for antibiotics that shouldn't be in our milk at all. And these sulfa drugs have been banned for use in dairy cattle for over 30 years because when they're given to cows, they can concentrate in the milk, and studies have shown that their exposure could lead to health problems. The biggest health concern is acute hypersensitivity, so that's a life-threatening allergic reaction. But even outside of allergic reactions, there are all kinds of other adverse side effects connected to sulfa antibiotics, from minor things like rashes, headaches, etc., to major things like birth defects, hypothyroidism, etc. So I don't want to get anyone panicked about the residues that we're finding in milk. We saw these drugs at really low levels. I just want to point out that there's a reason that these drugs were banned in the first place. I also wanted to touch on the methods because there have been some kind of coordinated pushes to discredit the study by saying that the analytical methods that we used aren't the same methods used by the FDA. And that is true. We aren't using the FDA's methods, and that is because our methods are a lot more advanced and sensitive than what's approved for field use. So most tests of milk that get done, especially to make sure you're in compliance with the FDA, have to be done quickly. So they use quick dip tests, kind of like pregnancy tests. So you just indicate if a chemical is there or not. And they only pick up that chemical at a certain level. We used laboratory methods, which take a lot longer, they're more expensive, but they're also more sophisticated. So we were able to look at residue levels below those quick dip tests that the quick dip test can detect. So for example, the FDA did a survey back in 2016 looking at the presence of antibiotics, and they found much lower levels of detection than we did because their limits of detection, so the concentration at which they reported detection, was not as low as the levels that this study was able to detect. So with sulfa drugs, the ones that I just mentioned, the FDA was only able to detect levels above 10 parts per billion. We were able to look at levels down to 1 part per billion, so we can really see what's going on in milk a lot more accurately. And just a reminder that all these analyses were done blind, which helps to point to the validity of the methods because the researchers in the lab didn't know which samples were organic or conventional when they were analyzing them. So the differences that we're seeing between organic and conventional milk can't be explained by methodological differences between what the FDA uses and our more advanced methods. So basically, we found that the presence of antibiotics in conventional milk is much more ubiquitous than previously thought, and that organic doesn't have any antibiotics in it. All right, moving on to growth hormones. So growth hormones are actually naturally occurring in cows, but there's also a synthetic form that can boost milk production and weight gain. Synthetic bovine growth hormone is banned from use in organic milk, but it's still used on some conventional operations, and there's no federal limit set for how high those levels can be in milk. So this slide shows the type of growth hormone on the horizontal axis on that graph, and then the level of that growth hormone that we found on average on the vertical axis. And the blue bars are the averages for conventional milk, and the green bars are for organic. And you can see that the organic levels of growth hormones are much lower than conventional levels. So basically, the organic levels are kind of what you'd expect to see for an average cow with naturally occurring growth hormones. The conventional levels, on the other hand, are 20 times higher than the organic levels, which suggests the use of synthetic growth hormones. And when it comes to growth hormones in milk, what we really don't want to see is elevated IGF-1 levels, because those are biologically active in humans, and they've been linked to things like colorectal cancer. So injecting cows with synthetic bovine growth hormone can boost production of IGF-1 in cows, both of which we found to be higher in conventional versus organic milk. So this study didn't try to link the levels of growth hormone that we found with the use of synthetic growth hormones, can be sure of is that there are significant differences between the growth hormone composition of organic versus conventional milk. So now for our pesticide results. For those of you who aren't familiar with pesticides, they're basically any chemical that is used to fight insects, fungi, rodents, or weeds, and some of them have also been linked to negative human health effects. There's been a lot of research looking at pesticide levels on organic versus conventional crops, showing that organic has significantly lower levels of pesticide residues, and we extend that knowledge to milk. So one of the main reasons understanding pesticide levels in our food is important is that it's been the top hypotheses that accompanies a lot of the studies that have been coming out lately showing advantageous health outcomes for groups that eat more organic food. So we really wanted to understand how the dairy portion of our diet fits in with pesticide exposure. The graph on this slide shows pesticides that are currently used in in conventional agriculture that we detected in milk samples. That horizontal axis has the names of the pesticides, and then the vertical axis shows the percentage of samples with detectable levels. The blue bars are conventional, and then those non-existent green bars are for organic. They're non-existent because we didn't find any organic samples with any detectable levels of currently used pesticides. Conventional samples, on the other hand, it was pretty common to find pesticide levels in them, including pesticides like atrazine, chlorpyrifos, cypermethrin, diazinon, permethrin, so pretty frequent presence of pesticides. And I wanted to highlight chlorpyrifos because it's been getting a lot of media attention lately, so you may have heard of it. The EPA did research on this a few years ago and recommended that it be completely removed from use in the US because exposure is associated with multiple health risks, especially for farm workers and farming communities. And several studies have linked prenatal exposure to organic phosphate pesticides like chlorpyrifos with things like respiratory and brain development issues, as well as autism. It still hasn't been banned federally, but we're starting to see states step up and take action. So chlorpyrifos has been banned in California, New York, Hawaii. Basically, it's not something you want to see in 69% of conventional milk that you're buying at the store. And chlorpyrifos isn't the only concerning pesticide residue in conventional milk. Atrazine is another one that's had a lot of research done on it recently. Basically, what it comes down to is that the easy way to avoid all these residues is by choosing organic. All right, so I want to circle back around to the importance of dairy in our diets, especially for kids, because the point of this study isn't to discourage dairy consumption. It's completely the opposite. It's trying to provide an alternative for people who are worried about chemical residues in their milk. Dairy has all kinds of health benefits. It's an important source of proteins, vitamins, minerals. It helps build strong bones and muscle development. It's a good source of essential amino acids. And other than water, milk is the only beverage that's recommended for kids by the American Dietary Guidelines. Dairy is also really delicious. My daughter is obsessed with what she calls spicy cheese, known as pepper jack to the rest of us. And I don't even want to admit how much ice cream I ate when I was pregnant. So basically what this study does is it gives people an answer for how they can enjoy dairy if they're worried about things like pesticides, antibiotics, or growth hormones. You don't have to stop buying dairy. Just choose organic and you can avoid all that. And throwing in a couple other issues at the end here that weren't really the focus of the study, but they're also really important to keep in mind. So organic cows are required to be primarily pasture raised, and what feed they are given has to be 100% organic. So that means that organic milk production has less reliance on conventional grain with heavy inputs like synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which are major contributors to climate change. Organic pastures also, they don't just reduce greenhouse gas contributions, they can also sequester carbon because pastures help lock carbon away into the soil. And another of the lesser known aspects of organic cows is that they have to have year-round access to the outdoors. They have to have access to shade when it's hot, to shelter, to exercise, fresh air, clean water, direct sunlight, etc. So animal welfare standards are built into organic regulations, and they get audited regularly, at least annually, with kind of pop quiz audits as well, just to make sure that the standards are being followed. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up because I want to have a lot of time for questions. So the takeaway from this whole study, certainly the findings about conventional milk are extremely concerning, but there's good news too. So if you're worried about antibiotics, growth hormones, pesticides, there's a really easy way to avoid them. Just choose organic. So for me, it's this really positive takeaway that when I'm looking at organic in the store, I don't have to worry about the chemicals that I might be concerned about because this study shows that they aren't there. All right, so Libby, I think we can open it up to questions at this point.
Yeah, that'd be great. Just as a reminder, you can use the questions panel to ask any questions. And a reminder to the members of the media that are in attendance, we'd request that you refrain from asking any questions today. After the completion of the webinar, please do contact our Director of Media Relations, Maggie McNeil, with any of your questions, and she can appropriately facilitate them. So the first question, Jessica, that I have for you is, could you discuss what you see as the next steps for research and how to build off from the study?
Yeah, so what we want to do next is kind of take this in multiple directions. So one way that we could extend this is to look at additional pesticides, pesticides that are a little bit more complicated to test for, things like glyphosate, that are still pretty ubiquitous in our environment, but really understand what other pesticides that we didn't look at in this study might we be exposed to in milk. Another thing that we want to do is take this beyond milk. So this study was really focused just on milk samples, but we're also interested in things like cheeses, yogurt. How does processing dairy impact exposure to these chemicals? And then another study that would be really interesting is what's called a dietary intervention study. So if you take some people who've been eating conventional for a set number of time, and then essentially just replace all those conventional items with organic items, and in this case, organic dairy, to understand how that has an impact on the chemicals in our body. So this has been done with organic food, looking at the entire diet of families, but we'd like to look at it from the dairy perspective to see how it actually alters, especially hormone levels in our bodies, because that's kind of laying the groundwork for understanding how it might have health implications. Because this study didn't look at any health implications. It was really just focusing on what's in milk and what's not. So kind of taking this to the next level would be a way that we could extend it.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So there's a follow-up question that I thought I'd ask right now. So someone is wondering, have there been any studies about how processing milk may impact the chemicals in conventional milk?
Yes. And so things like differences in pasteurization can have an impact on how much growth hormone is actually left in that milk. So definitely processing can impact the chemicals that you see in milk. And we honestly weren't trying to explain why. So for example, with the growth hormones, ultra pasteurization, which a lot of organic milk is known to decrease growth hormones in milk. So it's possible that that explains the differences between organic and conventional. We weren't looking at the reasons. We were just looking at what's actually there. And what's there is a lot more of these chemicals in conventional than in organic. So what we were doing was more descriptive than looking at the reasons behind it.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to jump to some questions that we have more about antibiotics. So one question was, did the study also look at glyphosate residue levels at all?
That is an excellent question. We did not look at glyphosate. And the reason is because those testing methods haven't been developed. They're a little bit complex to develop and expensive for milk. So that's one of the follow-up studies that we want to do, is look at other chemicals like glyphosate that we'd expect to see pretty ubiquitously, especially in conventional milk, and really understand how often it shows up. And one of the reasons why we'd expect to see it so much in conventional milk is that a lot of conventional cows are raised on Roundup Ready GMO soybeans. And so all of that glyphosate, that's the active ingredient in Roundup that gets sprayed onto this feed grain, ends up in the body of the cows and might be able to show up in milk. So that's the hypothesis for why we'd like to look at glyphosate next, is because a lot of this chemical is getting used on the feed for conventional cows. For organic, since most organic is pasture raised, and even the grain that it is feed has to be 100% organic, we'd expect that we wouldn't see any in there. So that's kind of our hypothesis and the reasoning behind it, and why we want to look at that chemical next.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So there's another question about testing that was wondering if the study tested at all very long chain fatty acids. So we were just looking at the milk itself, and Dr. Barr wasn't able to make this call. She's the one who actually developed those methods. But what we suspect is that a lot of the chemicals that we found are bound to the fat inside the milk. So so that's kind of how it gets transferred into the milk. That's not true with all of the chemicals, but a lot of them end up in the milk from binding to the fat inside milk. Great, thanks. So another question was if there's any plans to do testing on plant-based beverages for pesticides.
So the reason we didn't do plant-based beverages is because there's been so many studies that compare organic with conventional crops. And so when we were kind of looking at where the biggest needs were, we went to dairy because since there's been so much research on pesticides, especially in conventional versus organic plants, we thought that question, I think it would be an interesting analysis, but since there's been so much research there, we're pretty sure that if you compared organic with conventional plant-based milk, you'd see the same things, that in conventional, there are a lot more pesticides than in organic. So we focused just on dairy, but there's been a lot of research comparing organic with conventional plants that would translate to plant-based milk.
Great, thanks. So another question was if you looked at all comparing the levels of like a skim milk versus a whole milk?
Yeah, so we actually tested 2% milk for this study. And the reason was because 2% is the most commonly purchased milk. But that's actually an interesting follow-up study to see how these different chemicals, the different chemical composition changes based on what kind of milk you purchase. And it's really interesting if you look at the EPA limits for things like, for certain pesticides, some of them are limits for milk regardless of whether it's skim milk or whole milk, but others are limits on milk fat. So what you have to do is actually understand how much milk fat is in the milk that you're buying. So 2% milk fat. And then calculate how high the pesticide residues are for that milk fat level of milk. So we didn't look at it, but I think it would be interesting given the differences in EPA tolerances for different milks of different milk fats. And I think it would add to our understanding of how these chemicals get into milk.
Great, thanks. So another question was, someone noted that there are differences in pasteurization and that they weren't mentioned by the authors in the work, and if you could speak to that at all.
Sure. So this is something that I just mentioned, that different types of pasteurization has different impacts on chemicals, especially growth hormones. So with pasteurization, you see a decrease in a lot of the structure of growth hormones. So when you're detecting growth hormones, they're a lot lower in pasteurized milk. And with hyperpasteurization, allows milk to be on shelves longer. You'll see even lower levels of those growth hormones. So that's something that we were thinking about as we were seeing these results, is that could be an explanation for what we were finding, especially with growth hormones. But we didn't build this study around pasteurization. There have been a few studies looking at how pasteurization impacts growth hormone levels. I haven't seen any on how it impacts things like pesticides or antibiotic residues. But that would be an interesting follow-up if you're looking at the why. Why do we see these differences?
Thanks. So another question was, it's kind of related. The person asked how a consumer would know about the different ways of pasteurization at the retail level, or is that really essentially a black box? And I'm not sure if you can speak to that question, but I thought I'd raise it.
Oh yeah, so that's a good question. Most of the milk that I have seen on the shelves says whether it's pasteurized or hyperpasteurized, etc. And you can just see it right on the box. I do not know if that is a regulation that companies are required to follow, or whether it's something that they voluntarily add to their packaging. But that's usually where you can see it.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to transition a little bit theme-wise. So one of the questions that someone brought up was that a criticism has been that the study and testing was actually from 4 years ago. Can you talk a little bit about how research happens and the timeline that it takes to get a study released and published?
Yeah, no problem. So if you look at any study that gets published in a peer-reviewed journal, it's usually from several years ago, which is unfortunate, but that's kind of the timeline that studies like this take. So, for example, we did our collection of these milk samples in 2015. We analyzed them in 2016. Then we started writing the manuscript. And then we submitted that manuscript for publication. And it took over a year to get reviewed by that peer-reviewed publication, which seems like a huge hassle. And why would we even go through that? And the answer is because that's what protects the integrity of this research. When we submit it for a peer-reviewed journal, the editor sends it out to experts in the field who will blindly review it. So the researchers don't know who's reviewing it. And these are not people that are friends with the researchers or who have any connection with them. They can't have any conflict of interest. These are just experts in the field outside of the connection set of those original authors. And those reviewers will review the paper and make sure that everything from the idea for the study to the methods to the results, how those results are interpreted are accurate and fall in line with very high scientific standards. And through that process, they usually have some comments and edits, and those can be minor or major. And those edits get sent back to the researchers, the main authors, and those authors have to respond to every single one of those comments and redo any parts of the study that were flagged by those reviewers as being potentially problematic, and then resubmit to the journal. So that way, and then that can go through several rounds of review. And in that way, you really make sure that the analysis and the results and how those are getting communicated are in line with current scientific standards and are accepted by the scientific community as a whole. So all that to say is that it takes a long time to get research conducted and through that peer review process.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So another question is a little bit of a follow-up to that one, and the question was about the number of sample sizes, and just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. So we only sampled 69 sample sizes, and honestly, we were doing that because we weren't trying to do an exhaustive study. This was kind of a smaller study about looking for trends. And I wasn't expecting to see any statistical significance between organic and conventional just because of the smaller sample sizes. And when you do statistics comparing organic and conventional or any two groups, it takes that sample size into account. And with lower sample size, it's harder to find statistical significance. So when we got our results, it was pretty surprising how strong the differences were between organic and conventional. And even with that small a sample size, we were able to see extremely significant differences between organic and conventional, which means that if you were to scale this study up, it would be very likely that you would find similar results. So even with smaller sample sizes, our statistical analyses were so strong that it suggests that our sample sizes were robust enough to really understand what's going on in the population.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So another question that we have here is, were most of the milk samples tested from national brands, or were they from local, more private brands?
So that is all kept completely confidential. We didn't want to call anyone out with this study. We just wanted to do a national survey. But our hope is that by handing this information over to the FDA, and we've been in talks with the FDA, that the FDA can do a survey, hopefully using more accurate methods, and approach the farms, processors, companies, et cetera, that are in violation, especially when it comes to antibiotics.
Thanks. So another question related to methodologies a little bit is actually wondering how OTA funded the study, and if you could speak to how those people are responding to the naysayers who say that the research benefits organic producers.
Yeah. So the study was actually funded through the Organic Center, not the Organic Trade Association. The Organic Center is a nonprofit, and we get funded through multiple different sources. We get funded through, we do get funding through industry, but also from individual donations, from federal grants, through the USDA, from private foundations. So we have a pretty diverse donation base. And in addition to that, we have a very strong conflict of interest policy. And basically, none of the research that we help fund gets influenced in any way by us. So the researchers are the ones who approached us for this study. They're the ones that developed, conducted, et cetera, the whole study. And to top it off, the analyses, like I mentioned, were done blind. So even the people in the lab doing the comparison didn't know which samples were conventional and which ones were organic. And then we made sure that any study that we fund goes through that peer review process to really ensure the integrity of the study and to remove any even possibility of bias from funders. So we have several steps in place to prevent biases of our studies. Also, the study would have been published regardless of what we found. Even if we hadn't found any difference between organic and conventional, since we're collaborating with an academic institution, those researchers publish all of their research, or at least attempt to publish it. So the researchers would have published it regardless of what it said. So I think that my comment to the people who are pointing fingers and saying that this supports the organic industry is, hopefully this isn't supporting the organic industry. This is supporting consumer understanding about what's in their food and allows them to make better, more informed choices when they're shopping. And also, hopefully it'll boost the consumption of milk across the board, because when Jean contacted us, she mentioned that she's heard from parents that some of them have stopped feeding their kids milk because they're worried about these chemicals. So what this study shows is it's really this option for those people who are worried about chemicals to keep feeding their family milk. So what we're hoping is that it's actually going to boost milk consumption across the board.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Can you talk a little bit about what the FDA said about the findings?
Yeah, so we spoke with the FDA. They didn't seem surprised about the findings, and that's because when they've done tests in the past, well, they didn't seem surprised about most of the findings, and that's because their tests, any tests that they've done that showed lower instances of antibiotics or pesticides were done with, like I mentioned, much higher detection limits. They were surprised, I think, by the frequency of use of illegal antibiotics, but for anyone on this call who has met with the FDA, they're pretty stoic, so they don't show their cards. So I don't know what their next steps will be, but we're going to continue to talk with them and work with them and collaborate in any way that we can to make it easier to test for these chemicals, and also to make it easier and more clear for farmers to follow regulations.
Thanks. So another question is if there is a difference in organic standards between the European Union and USDA with regard to milk.
Yes, there are, and the main difference between, so first of all, there's an equivalency agreement between the EU and the US. So things that are labeled organic in the EU can be sold as organic in the US and vice versa. So the standards are pretty similar. There are a few differences, and I think the main one is the use of antibiotics. So for both the US and the EU, if your cow is sick and has a bacterial infection that can be cured by antibiotics, you do have to administer antibiotics to that animal. This is, animal welfare standards. You're not going to keep your cow sick, especially after you try holistic methods, when you can help ease their pain. But in the US, that milk cannot be sold as organic anymore. So once that cattle gets treated with antibiotics, then you have to sell that milk as conventional, basically until the next gestational period for that cow. In the EU, that milk can be sold as organic. So that's, I think, the main difference between organic and conventional standards between the EU and the US.
Thanks. So another question is, how did some of these farms have access to illegal antibiotics? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to preface this by saying I work in organic, so my knowledge about antibiotics that are not, no antibiotics are allowed for use in organic is, I'm not an expert in this. Let's just put it that way. But when we did this study, we talked with a lot of farmers, both conventional and organic, a lot of vets, a lot of regulatory agencies to really understand what was going on. So I don't want to speculate about where these illegal antibiotics are coming from, but for the sulfa drugs, they are accessible because they're allowed to be used in animals that aren't lactating. So they're allowed to be used in, animals like hogs, etc., or even cattle that are being raised for beef cattle. And the reason why they're banned for use in organic is because these antibiotics can concentrate in the milk. So the illegal antibiotics, when I say illegal, they're not illegal across the board. They're just banned for use in lactating cattle. So they're very easily accessible just at any feed and supply store. You're just not allowed to give them to lactating cattle.
Thanks, Jessica. So another question was, there's research that low-income families are avoiding fruits and vegetables because of a fear of pesticides, and that they're not buying organic because of the cost. Do you think that low-income households will buy organic milk out of fear of pesticides, hormones, and antibiotics, given their ability to pay for more expensive foods?
So we are not trying to get people to stop drinking milk. That was not the goal of this study. And if you look at the research out there, unfortunately, people are buying less and less milk. And that's kind of a pattern that we've been seeing, and replacing it with sugary beverages. So what we have seen is that one of the reasons for that is because people are worried about these chemicals. So that's happening regardless of studies like this. And what we wanted to do was set out to give those families an alternative that they could choose if they're worried about synthetic chemicals. And we're pairing this with a campaign that's trying to get organic milk more accessible across the board, especially to low-income families, by getting it in front of policymakers so that they start allowing organic milk to be used in things like school lunch programs. So for public schools, if you're enrolled in that school lunch program, you're only getting conventional milk, conventional dairy, conventional products, basically. So we have this outreach push that we're doing to policymakers to request them that they consider including organic milk in school lunch programs, and also make it accessible for SNAP programs. So accessibility is something that we've been thinking a lot about, and we want to make sure that that policymakers don't take an attitude that just because a population is lower income, that they can have lower quality food. We want to make sure that high quality food is accessible across the board. Thanks, Jessica.
There's been a few questions that I've seen in here about the differences between small and larger dairy operations, and I'm wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit to that, both with regard to the study itself. I know that you can't, from a blind perspective, there's not much you can say to that, but you can kind of clarify a little bit about the differences.
Sorry, I was on mute for some reason. So when it comes to the organic standards for organic operations, it doesn't matter what size you are, you still have to follow the same organic standards. So antibiotics, growth hormones, synthetic growth hormones, pesticides, those are not allowed for use no matter what size your operation when it comes to organic. And this goes for large scale operations to people with only, you know, a couple cattle on their operations. Everyone needs to follow the same standards. So, and also one of the kind of cool things that this study showed that was, it was like this cool side analysis is that the organic standards are working. And that means that when these chemicals are banned, and you know, we have these audits that happen on farms for organic, at least what we found is that you can actually trust the organic label because we didn't find any cheaters. Every organic sample that we tested didn't have any presence of antibiotics, had 0 levels of currently used pesticides, and had pretty low levels of growth hormones. So that's something that was really encouraging for me when I was looking at the results, is without really knowing the size of the operations for each of the farms that we tested, you can really easily see that the standards are working regardless of the size of operation. I also want to note that we weren't going out to the specific farms. So a lot of companies are cooperatives, especially when it comes to dairy. And cooperatives can include larger scale farms as well as really small family farms. So in the same label, even if it's a large scale national label, you can still have a lot of smaller family farms in there. So it's, even if we knew the labels that we tested, we wouldn't be able to understand the scale of the operations for all of them, because a lot of these cooperatives have multiple different scale levels operating within the same company. But let me just end with saying that the good news is that regardless of the scale, when it comes to organic, we aren't seeing these chemicals. So that's encouraging.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I think that we have time for one more question. And I'd like to ask the following question. I'm pulling it back up. So someone asked that you mentioned that your daughter eats a lot of cheese, and she was wondering if you've done any research on organic and non-organic cheeses and whether if you expect those findings to be similar or not. And I know you've touched on this a little bit, but I thought it might be a helpful one to come back over again since it's been asked a few times about different study types.
Yeah, so I definitely expect the findings from this study to translate to cheese. But I would love to do a study that looks at cheese specifically, especially considering how obsessed my children are with it. But I definitely think that what we find in milk is going to echo what we find in cheese.
Great, thanks so much, Jessica. I think I'm going to wrap us up right now. Many thanks to you for today's really educational webinar on the benefits of organic dairy. We really appreciate your time. We'd love to invite those of you still on the line with us to consider joining us for one of our upcoming webinars this summer. You can learn more about our upcoming webinars at ota.com under our programs and events. Next week on Wednesday, July 24th, please do consider joining us for best practices in social marketing. We'll be talking about the latest findings to share ways to design and implement social media campaigns for international and domestic audiences. It'll be presented by Matt Street, the Executive Vice President of Digital at Edelman, the Organic Trade Association's International Trade Manager, Alexis Carey, and our digital specialist, Kelly Tavares. The Organic Trade Association is a membership-based organization for the organic industry. We ensure that all parts along the organic value chain have a strong voice with government and the public. We bring farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, and others together to promote and protect the growing organic sector. OTA represents its members to government on sector needs, market development and promotion, and strong organic standards and regulations. Members also receive the latest information and quick answers on organic regulations and standards in the US and around the world.